Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We're hosting this conversation at a time when our industry, from mining to batteries to manufacturing, is under threat. This weekend's surprise proclamation of 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum underscores the chaotic business world we're living in, and we still don't know what's going to happen with across-the-board tariffs. All of this is happening against the backdrop of slowing EV uptake in North America, and some rough patches for some prominent projects, including here in Canada. But there are two things that I think are really important to keep in mind. First, this technology isn't going anywhere. If you look at major technological transitions over time, electrical power, household appliances, and yes, internal combustion vehicles, there were ups and downs before they all reached mass adoption. In the end, though, they were all better technologies than the ones that people were using before them: gas lamps, horses and buggies, etc. EVs are better technologies than what's being used now and what has been used over the last number of decades. And we will see mass adoption. In fact, in other places across the globe, we're starting to see this. So that was the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that Canada's opportunity remains strong. We still have the raw materials that keep us relevant. We have innovators in battery materials and technology, and we still have an important auto sector here in this country. But there's no doubt that the contact story has changed over the past 3 months, or maybe even longer than that. So the question is, for me, how do we get to where we want to go, which is a strong, comprehensive zero-emission vehicle supply chain and industry in this country that's an important part of our GDP now that the paradigm has shifted? So a big part of the answer is going to lie in policy, clearly, and in politics. I can't think of two better people to discuss this than our two guests today. Raitt is the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC Capital Markets. Lisa served for 11 years as the Conservative MP for Milton. In that time, she served as Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. She served as Minister of Transport, Minister of Labour, and Minister of Natural Resources. Lisa serves or has served on the boards of many of Canada's most important corporations and civil society organizations, and is the co-chair of the Coalition for a Better Future. Pierre Fitzgibbon is a special advisor at Osler, and before joining the firm, Pierre was a member of the National Assembly of Quebec for Terrebonne from 2018 to 2024. In that time, he served as Quebec's Minister of Economy, Innovation, and Energy, and was a political force behind shaping the province's battery and zero-emission vehicle strategy, including launching La Filière Batterie Québécoise to develop Quebec's battery supply chain and to support the global transition to electrification. Pierre recently joined the advisory board of Voltage, the Concordia University-based initiative to bring together researchers, industry leaders, and policymakers to develop cutting-edge solutions in energy storage, electrification, infrastructure, and sustainable urban design. Welcome, Lisa and Pierre.
Yep.
So, as I mentioned before, this is a strange time we're living in. But I will say, even before these tariff threats, it seemed like Canada was at a bit of an industrial crossroads. On the one hand, we need to ensure that our legacy industries remain strong and competitive, but at the same time, we have to build out the innovative industries that we all know that we need, that are cleaner and that produce the products that the world's going to want and need in the future. Batteries and EVs are great examples of this. So I can't think of two better people to think about this. Here we are straddling the line. We're kind of at this fork in the road in a way. And a lot of what's going to have to happen is going to come from policy and policymakers. And I just want to sort of maybe start off and pick your brains a little bit on how policymakers and governments might think about navigating this tension, right? So how do we maintain growth in the traditional industries that we need, like oil and gas and traditional manufacturing, while also prioritizing policies that incentivize technologies like batteries and EVs? So maybe I'll start with you, Lisa. How do you think about, how we can move forward, maintaining our economy, maintaining growth, but also driving innovation in cleaner technologies like batteries and EVs?
Well, thanks, Matthew. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And it's a great honor to be on the panel with the former minister in Quebec. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to think about these things as well. I will say that I have been thinking a lot. I mean, hindsight is 2020, and we have the advantage point right now of being able to look over the past 10 years. And it's been kind of exciting in terms of where we have gone, where we've come from, and where we are right now with respect to electrification. And it was very much a hot topic, and it was very much something that lots of people poured a lot of efforts into. You mentioned the Coalition for a Better Future. One of the principal, I would say, fundamental values of the coalition is that the organizations believe in net zero by 2050 or by whatever date is possible. But we do believe in net zero. That being said, the kinds of policy tools that governments used was a combination of investment and regulatory measures, including mandates in terms of moving people from one kind of technology to another. And where we are right now in the political cycle is that it seems to be the pendulum is swinging in the other direction a little bit. And I would just say that we will find the center point at some point in time. It's going to swing one way, it's going to swing the other, but we will find that path through. And I do believe that the path does lend itself to new innovation and to new technology. It's just going to be a little bit longer and a lot more expensive than what we had anticipated. A lot of governments like to force their way. It was a very top-down driven kind of approach. But at the end of the day, politicians are only where they are because of voters and because of taxpayers. And if the change is such that it's causing pain on the taxpayer, they're going to react like any other person would react. And that is by pumping the brakes, to use a vehicle analogy, and saying, wait a second, I'm not really happy with the pace of what's going on. But I do believe that Canadians still fundamentally believe in it. I think they like the idea of moving away from I would say a mode of transportation that is putting pollution into the air. Canadians don't like pollution, and you saw that when we converted from coal in a lot of the plants here and all of the plants here in Ontario, actually. And as a result, it is a selling feature for Canadians. They do want to be environmentally aware, but they also don't want it to cost, so that they're having to make a choice in terms of their quality of life and where they're going. So what I would say to policymakers is, as much as we think it's very cool to rush down a road of new technology, hoping that innovation catches up, putting all the force and the weight of a government and their tax treasury behind it, the reality is that it's the taxpayer that calls the shot. And if you move too fast in one direction without really filling in all the blanks and bringing people along with you, you're not going to get there. The problem was defined, the solution was presented, but the value proposition of how much it was going to cost, both in terms of personal sacrifice and cost to the Treasury, wasn't adequately understood. So I would say to people, it's a lull. The pendulum's going to go in another direction for a while, but we'll get to the right equilibrium at the end of the day.
That's helpful. Thanks. Pierre, I wonder if you've got some thoughts on how, traditional industries can be maintained, because they have to be. We need to make sure that, keep the lights on, I guess, is an analogy. You can go anywhere you want with that. But, we need to make sure that the Canadians are employed, that our economy remains strong. But we know that we have to build out these industries. Yes, for, as Lisa said, for the environmental reasons, pollution, et cetera, but also because it's a huge economic and industrial opportunity for the country.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Matthew, for the invitation. Very honored to be here, and nice to be together with Lisa as well. We came into office at different times, but very complimentary. So I'll come at this a little bit different than Lisa, but we'll end up at the same place. I think in Quebec, Quebec is 9 million people out of more than 35 million people in Canada, close to 40. So we are nimble. We have a very diversified economy, which at times is positive, at other times it's negative, because the issue to me relates to the productivity enhancement. We've been talking about that for years in the country and in Quebec as well. Clearly, what's going on right now south of the border is exacerbating that enhancement requirement. So I was in office in 2018 when we got elected, and I spent 6 years running energy and economy. And clearly, one of the things we wanted to do at the time is to look at where Quebec would have comparative advantage to other jurisdictions, so we could be more productive and have a chance to be a player on a world scale. So this is easier said than done. So we spend a lot of time to look at areas where we could be a world status. And we came up with this idea of what we call in Quebec the innovation zone, which is pretty much the cluster approach than Mr. Porter came through in the 80s. So we look at these clusters. Where could we be good? But a cluster to me is not only putting an industrial plant into a geography. It's about unifying the academia, the applied research, some large enterprise to come, and also have the startup and the incubator around. So you build that cluster, which is tightly related, and that's a supply chain by itself. So if you can focus on some, and we'll come to that later, but if you can on some, and you, as a government, as a policymaker, you support these clusters, a number of them, not cannot be endless. I think you have a chance to be more productive and to also be less dependent sometimes on the volatility of the market. So in our case, for example, thanks for those who preceded me, we're pretty strong in Quebec in aerospace, for example. So that was easy to kind of put forward. Also, we have a lot of fundamental AI. We had a super cluster from the Canadian government in 2018. So we built some strong footprint there. So we were able to get to quantum computer. Right now, we've IBM is building the first quantum computer in Canada and based in the Eastern Township. And EV came all about because of our natural resources, our low-cost energy, and also we kind of piggyback on Mr. Biden CHIPS Act, where we have the ability to make the way to build on a wafer to put semiconductor. So I think clearly to be at the right place in the world, we need to focus again where we can have comparative advantage. Then the government can put some policies to attract investment and also incubate some startups, so at least you're not totally dependent on foreign investment.
So I want to stay with you, Pierre, just briefly, because picking up on something that Lisa said about making sure that the voters are along for the ride, right? And so Quebec, in your tenure in office, saw huge investments into this supply chain, really putting it into a leadership position continentally, right? But it wasn't necessarily obvious to outside observers that this was something that Quebec would have done 10 years prior. You know what I mean? So I'm curious to know how you thought through, you identified some of the advantages that Quebec has when it comes to critical minerals, when it comes to, you say, AI. So it's really kind of advanced academia. But how did you think through bringing Quebecers along, right? Because these are big investments. These are big expenditures of, yes, capital, but also political capital.
No, you're right. It's a good question because I've obviously, as government, as policymaker, want to focus on some industry. There's some critic who says, why would the government pick where we're going to go? So obviously, in running economic development of any jurisdiction, you got the more libertarian approach, where a government could say, well, we'll provide investment tax credit, it will provide some assistance for high-paying jobs, and we'll let the market decipher where it should go. Given that Quebec, if we look at the wealth of Quebecers, if you measure that by GDP per capita, we're lagging. We're lagging to Ontario, we're lagging to other provinces. So I felt, so as a premier in 2018, that we had to focus. We had to be somehow libertarian to offer a platform for any industry because we're very diversified. At the same time, we should be more as laser focused in some areas where we, back to my first point, by where we were having a competitive advantage. So EV is a good example. So EV required some large investment because to think that because we're nice in Quebec and we speak different languages and so forth, people will come here and build plants. It's utopia, right? It doesn't work that way. And this whole chase about the clusterization of the North American EV files, giving the strength in the US, required us to be more nimble. And also, for example, I realized that we wouldn't make cars in Quebec. Right. The car making province is Ontario. We make planes here. So I said, well, let's focus at the right place. And then we had to explain to people that it would cost money. And I can do numbers if you want later. But so it was the education side explaining the rationale. And we were, I would say, partially successful. We never totally successful. But then, of course, there's a bit of headwinds right now for all kinds of reasons. I mean, one would argue that Mr. Trump is pushing the goalpost away from us in terms of when
Yeah.
we're going to decarbonize, but I think that's temporary. But also there were technology pitfalls in some of the battery cell manufacturers. We were a victim of that with Nordvolt right now. So there's a lot of headwind right now. People saying, okay, well, is that an example where we shouldn't rely on government to pick areas where we should provide? And then you have to come back with the counterbalance and say, well, in the case of a EV file in Quebec, there's 10 billion of successful investment being built right now, which is unique. We never saw that before. But back to your point, social acceptability is about education, about reinforcing why we're doing it, reinforcing that, yes, we give subsidy, but the reality, the point or the objective is going to create more wealth out of that. It may take 4 or 5 years. The payback may be longer, but if you look at midterm, long term for society, maybe sometimes to accept there wouldn't be any return for 5 years, it's fine. If the industry or the cluster you're involved with is going to last for 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years.
That's fantastic. I will, Lisa, I want to come to you very briefly. I just saw that a message just popped up in the chat. Please do either in the chat or the Q&A function ask questions, and we will get to a number of them at the end of these kind of planned questions. And I thank you to people who sent in questions in advance, and we've kind of amalgamated some of them into questions. So thank you for that. But don't hesitate to put your hand up. But Lisa, I want to come back to you because Pierre just sort of mentioned the T word, tariffs. Well, that's the one T word we'll say. And it's a potentially cataclysmic environment we're walking into. I will say though that you were part of a government at a time when there was another cataclysmic event, which was the 2007-2008 economic crisis, and the government was forced to think through how it would save the auto sector back then, save it from massive job losses and really maybe sort of vacating Canada altogether. And I think it's fair to say that wouldn't have been the bias of the government of the day. I don't think that the incentives was sort of where things wanted to land, but at the same time, it was necessary. So I'm wondering if you could sort of talk us through a little bit how government of the day, you around the cabinet table, thought through the calculations that needed to be made, and if there are any lessons that we can bring forward to today as we walk towards yet another crisis.
Yeah. I wish there was a direct comparable to what happened in 08, 09 with today, but it's not, because it's different in this way. In 08, 09, the fundamental problem was that the American consumer got caught in housing issues. As a result, they didn't have disposable income, and there was not going to be any sales of vehicles. And that's kind of where the urgency came from. It was the fact that the purchase wasn't going to happen, inventory wasn't going to have to be created, and people were going to get laid off fundamentally. So that's where both the United States and Canada worked with each other to keep those manufacturing places open. It is a piece of industrial policy for the United States to actually have facilities available and ready to make large vehicles in times of crisis or war. And that was one of the pieces that went into consideration for the United States way back in 08, 09. They had to keep those factories open because, quite frankly, that's the way that they were going to build tanks if they needed to do something for a possible war. That's how they thought. In our case, it was to make sure that we were still part of the auto manufacturing game and that Canada wasn't going to be shut out. As a result, the conversations around the table was about where did we have to insert the Canadian taxpayers' investments into these different car makers to ensure that they were going to be able to make their case to American-based manufacturers as to why the Canadian places need to stay open. So once you got to that point, it was a pretty easy decision and a different negotiation. The U.S. negotiated different pieces into their agreements with their car manufacturers than we did. They had some stuff around unionization. They had some stuff around closing of plants. We as well had some stipulations with respect to working with the car manufacturers at the time. But the reality is, Matthew, is that if you take a look at the jobs in the area that I represented, Milton, Ontario, Oakville, Ontario, the remarkable amount of jobs and economy is actually predicated and based upon auto workers' jobs. So anytime you see an Ontario-based politician talking about car manufacturing, they know how important it is in terms of the economy writ large in Ontario. And that's why you're seeing Doug Ford right now, Premier Ford, out there really making the case with respect to auto manufacturers, especially in the face of these kinds of tariffs. So back then we needed to work with the United States to make sure we didn't get shut out. It is kind of the same situation, but driven from a different point of view. It's not the fact that Americans are not going to have a robust economy and they're not going to be able to buy cars. It's the fact that the president has stated that he wants all manufacturing in the United States. So how do you deal with that? I mean, that's a completely different beast. And it's going to take a lot of, I would say, diplomatic gymnastics to get where we need to get.
I like that term, diplomatic gymnastics. I'm writing it down. Before we are going to talk about tariffs probably a little bit more detail. But before we really kind of tackle that, I just want to maybe pick your brains a little bit because, Canada has bet big on battery gigafactories over the last 4.5 years, as did Quebec and Ontario. And I think the idea was, well, let's anchor this industry. It'll act as a pull on our natural resources industries or critical minerals, and it'll act as a way to keep our auto sector here, push down into the downstream, right? The calculation, I think it was sound thinking. You can't account for black swans necessarily, but even before the current black swan, we saw a bit of a slowdown. So I'm wondering, a slowdown in terms of uptake. Yes, I mentioned that at the front end, but also we're seeing some challenges with some of the projects in Canada. And I'm wondering if there are ways that new political leadership might want to think about this. We know that there's a federal election on the way. There's a lot of dynamism, let's say, in the political sphere right now, even discounting the conversation with the U.S. So as we kind of move towards a federal election, there will be a new prime minister at some point in the next few months. How should that person think through what we've done to anchor this industry? And I'm not necessarily looking for, precise, this is where the contract should be, et cetera, et cetera. But, this is, I think, the future of the sector. And yet, Lisa, as you say, it's going to take longer than we all thought. So it's a bit of a muddled question, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is, we know that these factories are opening up. We know that they're going to employ people. We know that this is the future of the sector, and yet we also know that there's a slowdown and there are political calculations to be made. So do with that question what you want. But Pierre, I'm going to go to you first if you want to tackle that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, of course, and we can get at this in different ways. But I'll be back. I'm back to my original statement where in 2018, 2019, I wanted to figure out new clusters that we could. Aerospace is an example. Quebec has risen as a world leader in aerospace because investment made 40 years ago. So that takes a long time to build these clusters. So I'll give you an anecdote, and I'll work from there. I was in Davos in 2019. I'd been in office for like 2 months, and somehow I got called by a meeting by Volkswagen. So interesting. They want to build a car plant in Quebec? No, it wasn't that.
No.
I walk in the meeting, and there was this young Asian lady that showed me a map of Quebec with all the lithium, the nickel, and the graphite mine, a map I didn't have. So I said, okay, well, something's happening here. So obviously, it's just an anecdote, but at the same time, we came back and I kind of got some help from outside help from consultants to say, okay, how can we, the EV was obviously discussed a lot. The people knew that there would be a North American cluster. The whole thing was depending on the Asian, kind of a Korean largely, and Chinese, of course, and to some extent Japanese. So I said, okay, there might be something there. Critical minerals, clearly, we have ample of them, including nickel, graphite, lithium, magnesium. And then we had also the low-cost energy. And I saw in the chat earlier, someone may have, maybe I wasn't clear when I said the tariff will be temporary. It's not the tariff are temporary. What I meant is that Mr. Trump right now is kind of moving the goalposts in terms of how fast we should decarbonize. But I think that that road is not going to reverse itself. So I think we
Right.
will decarbonize. The society wants that regardless of politician. So that was my comment, just to make sure that was clear earlier. So I came back and said, okay, how can we move upstream? Because Quebec has been known before for natural resources, mining. We had iron, we had gold, but there was no conversion. I mean, we basically extracted these resources and shipped them to different places. So how do we build the value chain? So clearly that came to mind that we could integrate ourselves, realizing Ontario was making cars. I said, I never wanted to make cars. So how far upstream can you go, or downstream, so can you go from the mine? And at the time, I said with the large firm I used to look at the competitive advantage, I said, we're going to work through battery materials. We won't even make cell. We'll just stop at cathode anodes. And that by itself was huge in terms of value creation versus what we did before. Furthermore, I think in the U.S., I mean, Quebec is not that far from Detroit, from the southeast. So therefore, I said Quebec can integrate itself, the transport system. So, and I was told by a couple of OEMs that they would rather have the cell closer to the car plant, and then they can import the cathode anode, which moves easier than the cell. So that's how we got to say, okay, this is going to be an interesting file. There'll be issues because there's no knowledge per se in Quebec in terms of EV. Although Hydro-Quebec had been in the forefront with a researcher that now, this is how I joined Voltage at Concordia University, that is managing the EV cluster for Canada right now with the Dalhousie, UFT, and Calgary. So we had some academic knowledge through Hydro-Quebec Research Center. We had the minerals, we had the low-cost energy. So well, let's build that. So that's how we got there. So right now, although there's a lot of headwinds, because we got fortunate to get one cell manufacturer called Nordvolt. Right now, obviously, Nordvolt is under serious restructuring. We don't know what's going to happen. But if I leave aside Nordvolt, we have a $10 billion kind of project going on right now with a couple of universities involved with that. We have POSCO, EcoPro, Volta. We have Rio Tinto now, who's bought Arcadium. They want to get into lithium extraction. So we're making lithium hydroxide. We're going to make 2 cathode plants. We may or may not have a cell manufacturer at one point. So I think, despite the headwind that we're having right now, I think that, I mean, there'll be battery in the future. Will it be LFP? Will it be NMC? To some extent, then people become agnostic because they use the same mineral to some extent, and we have a lot of phosphate here and iron. So therefore, LFP is going to be part of our makeup as well. So I think that I think it's important to support it, and there's a lot of investment. We're going to put probably 4 or 5% of the total capital investment into subsidies. So that's a big question. We talked about it earlier. People are saying, is that justified? Well, it's justified if you want to be a market player. The question, do you want to be a market player? And I think someone has posted on the chat, and it's a good question. Is GDP the only measure of wealth? Maybe not. But at the same time, given that social costs are rising in our province. 50% of our budget is for health. We may not be as efficient as we should be, but nevertheless, there's a lot of requirement of revenue. So I think it's the right strategy to do that, but there's some risk. There's no question.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the industrial policy question after this, but Lisa, I wanted to turn to you because, every government that comes into office is inheriting things that have been done by the previous government. And, that will be true regardless of who wins the next election, right? It will be a different prime minister. So I wonder if you have some thoughts around what our next prime minister should be thinking around this whole project, because we have, invested lots and lots of money and lots of political capital into this. And by political capital, I mean Canada's reputation globally, right? And so it would be a real shame to sort of see things die on the vine. Nobody wants that, but I appreciate that it's also a previous government's, initiative.
Yeah. So when I came in 2008, before we understood and realized the depths of the worldwide recession, I had programs that were in place that we continue to fulfill on. One was the biofuels, another one was wind. Another one was solar. And, you know, those programs, we continued to ensure that they were granted across the country. They were very popular with Conservative members of Parliament. Basically, any constituency out there, you probably had somebody in your riding who wanted to have windmills or they wanted to have solar. So those were things that we continued along, even though those were Paul Martin programs. We continued the eco energy suite of programming that was available. I would hope that a new government coming in, and I guess I'm just going to be clear, and I'm talking about a possible Conservative government. I'm not going to speak for Christia or you know, or Mark or what Karina would do or anybody else in there. But let me talk about what I think is possible with respect to Conservative, and I would say that language matters here, and it's not with disrespect that I say that the term decarbonization may not be the right term. The term may be electrification. And why electrification? Electrification is seen as positive. Electrification means it's cheaper. Electrification means that it's secure. Electrification means that you're going to get lower pollution. All of these things are good. And Conservatives concede the fact that electrification, we poured so much money into converting shore power at ports across the country, getting them off of dirty diesel, plugging them into the ports. We did the same for the North. We want to get people off diesel generators. So those are areas in which if you meet the Conservatives where they understand the benefits, then it's going to be much smoother and easier. I mean, one of the things I did in 2009 was we did an actual electrification roadmap for vehicles. And, you know, that kind of stuck with it. The other thing that I would point out as well, and you mentioned at the beginning of the questions, and I am sorry, Matthew, that I didn't actually talk to it more clearly, was the fact that you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. The Great Economic Recession was a lot easier in Canada because of our fossil fuel industry and our resource industry, quite frankly. And as a result, we're not going to be able to move to electrification for all sources of heating in the province of Ontario, for example. We're going to need natural gas. That's just the way it is. And as a result, demonizing fossil fuel or being seen to demonize it as old, outdated, antiquated, you know, the past, that's not an easy path forward for a Conservative government, because it's don't bite the hand that feeds you. Natural resources, those kinds of royalties are extremely important to a government and to their revenue. So again, it's about the balance, right? It's how do you make this happen faster is the question that we've been facing for the last 10 years. I think if we have a Conservative government, the question I think should be, how do we make sure that that door is still open? And what kinds of language should we be using? And what kinds of things should we be talking about in terms of public policy moving forward?
Well, it is really interesting, because you're absolutely right. You know, we live in the here and now, and we're thinking about tomorrow. And so we have to consider, you know, how we maintain a standard of living. I guess the question is, how do we make sure that our grandkids have got the same standard of living as the market changes, right? And that's, you know, not to be too nationalistic about it, but it's everybody's responsibility to make sure that our kids and our grandkids have got the highest possible standard of living, because we've enjoyed it, right? And so what we're, I think, all trying to do is make sure that we set ourselves up well for the future. Part of that, Lisa, as you say, is, you know, making sure that we have the money to do it, right? And so it is really really crucial. And maybe kind of sticking with that, and I'll stick with you, Lisa, if I can, just on industrial strategy, because we're kind of dancing around it a little bit. And although Pierre, I think you hit it a little bit more head on earlier, I want to get into the mind of a cabinet minister, or sort of a cabinet. You know, there's a back and forth that happens, right? So, you know, an industrial player, a company has an idea, or an industry altogether has an idea on a project, and, you know, they need policy change or regulatory change, or they need money. And, you know, it's a good idea. You can see the clarity of vision. But there are a lot of different demands on a government every day. Every cabinet meeting, there's something in front of you. You sort of say, well, I don't know if we can do that. So I guess one of the things I'm trying to get at is, how do cabinets and how does a cabinet minister weigh the benefits of a project? And, there's a balance, right? You don't want to pick winners. You also don't want to lose winners. And so, are there things that, people on this call would benefit from hearing when, they're thinking about approaching, a provincial or a federal government, or they've got sort of interactions currently? How does a cabinet think about this, at some of the calculations that go on? Lisa, I'll start with you and then I'll move to
Yeah.
Pierre.
So what a cabinet's going to think about is geographic, and quite frankly, make sure there's a balance across the country in terms of what's happening, and that you can't pour everything into Ontario. It has to be equally represented on the East Coast as the West Coast, the prairies in Quebec, and the North. So, a cabinet is made up, in the Conservative world, it's made up of representation from all the geographies across the Canada. And trust me, we all fight for our own little area. I'm sure Pierre experiences too in Quebec. I don't think the geographics is that much different. I will say, though, my favorite types of companies, and I'm saying this very sarcastically, were the ones that decided to pit regions of Canada against one another and kind of have this bidding war of where we're going to go. Is it going to be Ontario or Quebec? Let's negotiate with the provinces. And that was always difficult, because then you'd have your cabinet lining up and dividing in terms of who was going to get what. Happens because everybody is self-interested and wants to get reelected, and we care about our home province. So that is going to go through their minds. I think if I could be so bold to talk specifically on a possibility of a future Conservative cabinet, what they have been very clear. They are not interested in having proposals come to them that's going to cost them money. Industrial policy is going to have to move in a different way, I think. I think it's going to have to be more on the regulatory side. So
Right.
If you are coming to a future cabinet, come with solutions, not problems, and come with problems and solutions that aren't predicated on writing a check necessarily. Maybe income tax credits, but I'd also make the recommendation is start with your province and get the province on side, because a Conservative government is going to have great respect for the autonomy of the provinces and the autonomy of the commerce in the provinces of what they want. I give great kudos to what Pierre's government did in coming up with the plan, figuring out what they wanted, and going for it. I think every province should absolutely do that as well. And because that allows, the federal government to listen to the grassroots, listen to the people who are living it day in, day out, instead of a top-down approach of heavy regulatory hands that you don't really know what you're going to end up getting. All these unforeseen consequences and circumstances that come out of a broad policy hammer. Like you said, policy at this point is scalpel. It's not sledgehammer. And the feds only have a sledgehammer, quite frankly.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Maybe the instrument for the province is a little bit sharper. So Pierre, maybe I'll turn to you and think through, on this file, and maybe in particular, but just more broadly, how your cabinet and how you thought about these types of projects.
Yeah. Short of picking the winners, which obviously has a lot of risk, as
Right.
we all know, I think especially for Quebec, I think one of the key elements for me was to create a trusted business environment. Quebec has, of course, had the history of different movement in terms of secede from Canada or not. So foreign investors were always worried about that a little bit, and rightfully so too. Language issue as well. So I think it was very important for us, and I think our Prime Minister, Mr. Legault, tried to make a very strong effort to make people comfortable that the business environment was sound in Quebec, and frankly, I think we did. Of course, at times, I had always had to fight against my friend Vic Fideli in Ontario about getting the right version of the right play. But when people get into Quebec, they kind of like it. But at the beginning, there's issues that we have to go through. So that was something unique to Quebec. But I think we provided a good template. The second one is regulation, and I know we'll talk about that later probably. And it was the tariff impact on Canada, the Buy Canada concept everybody talks about. But we are sometimes our worst enemies. So therefore, as a government, I remember talking to Mr. Ford's group in Toronto. They had created the red tape minister. Yeah. We didn't quite did that, but we did something similar where we're trying to reduce the regulatory pressure on enterprise. Of course, I came from the private sector, so I thought there was too many rules. Once you manage a cabinet like I was, energy and economy, you need the rules, you need the regulation, otherwise it's going to be chaos. So where you find this fine line, and I don't think we're perfect, and I don't think the government's perfect. I'm no longer there, but we try to remove some of the regulatory, some of the rules, make sure people were comfortable, but yet you need to have a framework. The other thing that was important for me is the capital flow. I think government has limited amount of resources available, financial resources. So the thing I did first is I kind of did the mapping of the business development kind of a cycle to realize we were, and we call it the debt valley in French. I don't know, it's a word-to-word translation. We were lacking in Quebec of VC investment.
Yes.
So we did is I created a matrix about the development stage of a company and the different thematic of where we wanted to put some effort, and we kind of fill the holes. And I said, the government needs to provide, this was investment into funds, either buyout fund, growth fund, VC fund. I thought it was important for us to put some money, get some experts, so it's not the government deciding to pick the winners within an industry cluster. And I think that's work in progress, but we did fairly well there, because as one of the issue in Canada, it's only in Quebec, is that we lack of startups. If you compare to Israel, to Korea, to Singapore, so I look at those places where, so we have to change that. So capital flow, capital availability becomes very important, and the government should not be investing in company directly, other than large enterprise, but let the private sector do it. But sometimes you need to provide the incentive to get that going. And I think at the end, then you need incentive as well, because on the EV file, in our case, once the $10 billion gets finalized, I'm excluding Nordvolt for the time being, it's going to cost probably $400 million of subsidy from the Quebec government, but that's 4%. If the project works, it's going to pay by itself. But again, I don't want to get there. I've been there before. It's some risk. You have to pick some risk, but at the same time, you need to put the business environment in the proper footing, so people can come with ideas that you wouldn't have necessarily as a government official.
Yeah, and you just touched on the question that I wanted to ask next, because you mentioned the value of death, and we've talked a lot about some of the big projects, these battery gigafactories, these big mining projects, all really important. But a huge opportunity also exists for Canada for growth firms, right? I mean, we want Canadian innovation, we want IP developed here and patents here. We want Canadian companies mining and developing our resources here. But a lot of these companies are facing huge challenges, right? Capital, access to capital challenges in particular. And it's a familiar story. It's not just this sector; it's pretty much every sector of the economy, right? I mean, if you don't get big enough, you're either going to go bust or you're going to get bought out, and it doesn't stay in Canada. So, I'll stick with you, Pierre, and then at least I'll give you a little bit of time to think about this. But Pierre, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, because you talked a little bit about how the government that you were part of thought this through. You mentioned VCs. If you think about it another way, which would be, well, okay, you get to go back into cabinet, make these decisions, and enact more policies and regulatory changes that could allow these companies to stay in Quebec, right, and grow in Quebec. What else could be done to ensure that, in your case, Quebec firms, but more broadly, Canadian firms stay in Canada, innovate in Canada, patent in Canada, grow, and then basically create a broader and stronger tax base? I think is probably the theory.
I'm a strong believer on the education system. I'm a strong believer, and I gave the example earlier of EV because that's one of the topic today. But for those who know him, Dr. Karim Zaïb, who's was at Hydro-Quebec. I mean, remember my first trip when I went to Asia. I went to Korea, Japan, and China for 2 weeks in the kind of mid-2019 when I realized we had something there. Pretty much all the companies I met told me, "Where's Karim?" And I realized that one of the elements of attractiveness of foreign investment is your ability to have education, applied research to be used. To a point that today, I'll give an anecdote, but Nordvolt in Sweden has tremendous issue, as you all know. Well, they hire, as one consultant, they have numerous people from Concordia University because of their knowledge of technology in battery materials, different technology. So I think to me that's where it starts. I mean, that went back to my innovation zone cluster or the Porter cluster in the 80s. I think if you build a strong academic footprint, you put the proper amount of money into share of research, share applied research, that will attract company, and then that will create a stimulus to get startups to emerge out of that. So, for example, the Apogee is something, I don't know if Lisa, you were there, but the Apogee a cluster approach from the federal government makes a lot of sense. I mean, Ontario got the manufacturing 4.0, we got the AI, and now the Canadian government worked with the Concordia together with Dalhousie, UFT, and the Calgary about the EV. But this is about they put $125 million to promote 400 PhD that over time, 5 years, will build some applied research in the whole EV. Well, that's going to benefit the whole country. So I think starting from the base education, having strong universities, trying to make that link between the fundamental research and the applied research. I launched in Quebec what we call the R&D, the innovation strategy. That was difficult. It was a challenge because you don't want to tell a researcher what to search for. At the same time, you don't want fundamental research to be put in inventory somewhere where the IP is not being used. So how you commercialize innovation, how you commercialize research, I think is the key. And I look at, again, I'm back to my comparison to Israel, to Korea, and to Singapore, to name those. And I think they're mastering that. How you get the research from universities to be applied, to be commercialized and be applied. So I think that to me is important as a province, as a state, as a country, to promote that university, academic, and enterprise work hand on hand. That's the only way to succeed to me.
Terrific. Lisa, thank you for that. Lisa, what are your thoughts on that?
So in terms of, how a government is going to approach these kinds of issues, and I agree with Pierre, nobody wants to pick winners and losers, and it's trite, but it's true. Government is there to create the conditions for people to want to make the investment. So how does big government, federal government do it? It's simple. It's lowering the cost inputs. So talk about training, HR, highly educated, highly trained workforce. And we're doing that in Canada. We have fairly high technical people, but we got to keep them. And the problem is that we're going to see a bit of a brain drain in the coming years. We got to keep power, electricity, and heating lower for them. That's another big cost input. Transportation, another big cost input for them. So the traditional role of federal governments of building power and building roads still makes a lot of sense, and they're investments. And those are things that you can do and that you should do. And then the final part, which is, I think, above all else, the most important, it's taxation. And taxation goes back to both the people you want to keep and the people and the companies that you want to keep. And I'll give you the anecdote. I mean, if you take a look, when you over $218,000 a year is when you're paying 54 in Ontario, for example, you're paying 54% of your income goes to taxes, right?
Yeah.
Young people coming out of university are starting at 250,000. They are in the highest tax bracket, the innovators, the PhDs, the data scientists, the AI people, the investment bankers. That caliber of student is going in at that level already, and they're seeing 54.5% of their salary go into taxation, and it's going to be like that for the rest of their lives. And then they look at the United States, and the price differential is significant, and the cost of housing is lower. So government's got to figure out what it's going to do around taxation and get that balance better. I love the idea of focusing on innovation and creating great intellectual property for the country. But if it's too expensive to do business here, then no matter how great the ideas and the innovation is fungible, it will go with the people and it'll go anywhere else it can be purchased.
So this is really rich. We need to get to tariffs, and we have questions in here. So I'm going to try to, combine some points that have been made in the Q&A and the chat function, because I want to get to tariffs a little bit, given that it's, might change our entire world. So here we are on the precipice potentially of being tariffed at 25%. We submitted some thinking to the government last week on how to respond, at least from our industry's perspective, and that's really investing in Canadian procurement, Canadian innovation, and advancing projects, critical mineral materials projects that are already advanced. So let's put them over the finish line. Those are three things that can be done right away. I want to hear your thoughts, on one or two things that Canada should be thinking about, or really frankly doing, because we're doing a lot of thinking and talking around this and not doing a heck of a lot, to be honest. What should we be doing right now to at least safeguard ourselves to some extent to move through this threat? Pierre, I'll start with you, and then Lisa, and then I do want to get to a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Well, thanks. I think the one comment out of the box is that it's really scary what's going on right now, and I share Lisa's view on that perspective. We've been talking about that. We've been talking about tariffs now for 2 months, almost every day, right? Everywhere you go. The only good news I would say in all of that is that I think Mr. Trump listens to one thing: the financial markets.
Yeah.
And the financial markets, and Lisa can talk more eloquently than I on that, are speaking very loudly. They don't think it makes any sense. So at one point, I hope that's going to put some doses of realism in the Trump administration. But leaving that aside, there will be some tariffs of some sort coming probably today on the steel and aluminum. I've been watching news in the last couple of hours. So I think there's three things to me that are important. First of all, this whole thing about Buy Canada Act, and I'll get some anecdote on that but after. I think it's so important, and I think there's an occasion now, even more so than the pandemic, where we can unify Canada, and we're seeing it to some extent right now, is on this issue. The second one is, I think we need to have integrated supply chain. I repeat myself, but it's so important, because the more integrated you are, and we can talk about aluminum if you want, I'm pretty close to that sector, and the aluminum starts from Quebec, goes to the US, comes back being laminated, goes back in the US. So how are you going to be tariffing that? I mean, the more you are integrated, the more of a nightmare it's going to be for bureaucrats to make it happen.
Car parts as well, yeah.
And the third point is to diversify it, obviously, away from the U.S. to the extent we can, although I'm a believer that the U.S. is a strong market. It's our neighbors. We need to solidify our supply chain, but at the same time, we need to diversify. So Buy Canada, I'll give you an anecdote. I'm sitting as a Minister of Economy, in 2 months after I'm in office, I happen to be the president of the interprovincial trade, I forgot the name of that unit. So all the Minister of Economy got into Montreal. I hosted them just across the street from where I am right now. And I knew nothing about interprovincial trade at the time. So I got briefing book, like inches and feet of briefing books. And I bring that home the weekend. I read that stuff. It was all about why to say no to other provinces to change our rules, whether it's alcohol or something else. It was all the reason why I should say no to all my counterparts. And to realize that every Minister of Economy was there at the same briefing book about the reverse. So I had, I think it was Vic Fidel, I forgot who he was. I saw one of the minister who has more experience than I. said, well, what's going on here? Well, I mean, every province look at because in Canada, as we all know, economy is sovereign to a province, right? If the Minister of Economy in federal said, well, you're going to do this, well, if we don't know to do that, we don't do it. So therefore, the province are very sovereign in terms of economy. So when things are good, and at the time it was good, 2018, 2019, economy is booming. I mean, we were happy in Quebec. So why change our rules? Why to allow someone from Alberta to come and trade here while we want to protect? We were protecting our own environment. So that has changed completely. I spoke to the person who replaced me, and she said, Pierre, you wouldn't believe what's going on right now. And among the provinces, it's all about how fast can we get these rules out. Right. So I think the Buy Canada is a good example. But of course, you have to be careful, because as I said to some people, some provinces are on the positive end. They export sort of more to provinces than they get import. So this could change, and not everybody will win. But the theory, of course, is the Canadian pie of trade within provinces will increase, because we'll replace some import goods or services, because we've got the ability to have to grow these Canadian companies, wherever they are in the country, to become more significant, more productive. Then henceforth they can deal with other provinces where they dealt with the US and Europe. So that, to me, the Buy Canada, everybody talks about that. I think the time is right, and I think that there's a will from the politicians to make it happen. But the prime minister talks about that. At the time I was there in 2018, nobody talked about it. But now prime ministers are making that an objective, then the bureaucrats will follow. Integrated business supply chain, I spoke about that. I don't want to go back there, but as I said, aluminum, I'm not as worried. Mr. Trump had put the tariffs on aluminum back in his first mandate. It lasted 6 months. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I mean, Ford wants to get aluminum to get the F-150 cheap. The American require the Quebec aluminum. They can't produce, and the building a smelter will take 15, 20 years. So therefore, it's a non-starter. I think there'll be some adjustments, and the more integrated we are, the more difficult it will be to impose these tariffs. And diversified market, well, of course, that's important too. I don't think we should move away from the U.S. market. As I said, it's a natural market. North-south trading is happening, is strong. We need to move east-west in Canada, but let's not depart from. But in dealing in Europe, we've got in Quebec the advantage. We've got delegation of Quebec, like kind of embassy, so to speak. And they're all been transferred into more economically driven delegation. We don't need to do formal. Other than in France, perhaps because of language. So therefore, we put a lot of economic people in these places. So we want to promote to have more export from Quebec company. Easier said than done. The exporting to Asia with the time difference, exporting to Europe is not easy. Different language, different system. So yes, we need to build some more momentum in export, but let's not kid ourselves. It's not going to take. It's going to happen overnight.
And Lisa, what in the face of this existential threat to all of us, what should we do?
What should we do? Such a small question, Matthew. Thank you for teeing it up. Okay, I'm going to give you a really simplistic kind of analysis on it, and forgive me, people may think I'm being superficial when I say it, but think about this as a really bad breakup. And when you have a really bad breakup in your life, what do? You say you're going to work on yourself. I'm going to spend some time alone. I'm not going to jump into another relationship. I'm going to work on myself. And I think that what we need to do is build a firewall around Canada, and we need to work on ourselves. And I think two areas that we should put great effort into, with the overarching goal of protecting against unemployment. That's what we have to do. Unemployment pushes us into a recession, and that is a real problem because that has a knock-on effect. So you got to protect against unemployment. Focus in on a couple of things. I would say focus in on building housing, figure out why housing isn't being built, and make those problems, if they're regulatory in nature, go away, and use the power of the public purse to make it attractive for people to want to build the housing. Cap how much you can make as a return. I think that's fair, but get it going and get people to work in building housing because we know we need it. And I know we need it all across the country. And then the second one is, again, build out electricity infrastructure in the country, because the one thing that we can do is become self-sufficient and then be attractive to the United States. And then the third thing I would do is at all costs, protect our water, protect our natural water. And know that that's the next call on our natural resources, especially when you look to the south. So those would be the kind of things I would do. Forget about those guys, protect against unemployment, and just go on a massive building spree of electricity and housing.
These are really great suggestions from both of you. There are a couple of questions. We don't have much time left, so I apologize for people who have been listening in. We've got some really great questions, so I'm going to smush a couple of them together right now. And one is around going back to industrial policy. How do we make it so that governments, whether they be at the federal level, having different departments working together, or having different levels of government working together, how do we make it so that we can break down these silos that do exist? We all know, everybody on this call knows it, and it's not surprising, I guess, but it really is an impediment to progress sometimes. And then I guess an add-on to that, how do we make it so that there are clear lines of communication between government and industry so that people know what language they're speaking together? I mean, have you seen this work well in some of the files you've been on? Maybe Elisa, I'll go back to you to start, and then Pierre, I'll ask
Yeah, it's the language of Ottawa versus the language of the rest of the country is very different from one another. You know, the adage is that you live in a bubble in Ottawa and you don't really know what's happening in the outer regions. But I would say that I believe that the officials now understand the importance of being in touch with what's happening across the country, and they'll have to do more when it comes to those kinds of things. And the reality is that government has been for a number of years a big piece of business, and it's going to continue to be a big piece of business.
Yeah.
I think we just want to make sure that there's a plan in place, and that people understand that we may have enjoyed for many, many years since free trade this natural growth as a result of the growth in the United States, but we should approach it from the point of view that is over. And
Right.
now we have to do what we need to do for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I would complement that by saying, the regulation I talked about earlier, changing the trade barriers, that's going to be very important. And I think there's a will from the different provinces to do it, maybe except one or two provinces, but it's going to happen. I think collaboration is important. I'll give you an example. I was speaking with Minister Wilkinson about 6 months ago. I mean, I've been looking at energy, and we didn't speak much about that, but that's part of our EV, I guess. And I was saying to Wilkinson, I said that there's a lot of wind farm being built in the world, and there's going to be a short supply of turbine very soon.
Right.
Why not having a Canadian procurement approach? I mean, if you go back 10 years, no provinces would have been involved with that. So no, I'm going to buy Hydro-Quebec will buy its own wind turbine. Well, if we work together, with 40 million citizen that speaking on behalf of 40 million citizens, it's much stronger than speaking about 13 or 9 million people. So that collaboration between the province and the federal government, I think there's a time in history where it can happen is now, because the Confederation in Canada has its challenges, as I said earlier, about the economic sovereignty and different sovereignty. But I think now we're no longer there. So there's elements of collaboration, and the federal government should play a role of leadership. And I think that the provinces, I think, are going to be much more amenable to work with the federal government, which has not been easy over the last, at least I can talk about that. But I think we
50
are
years.
now.
You can say 50 years. It's okay, Pierre. We're all difficult.
We have now, I think, the framework where
Yeah.
provinces are ready to work together.
Yeah, we are at time. I will say that the political dynamic seems to have shifted in Canada as well, maybe for the better. If we can see more collaboration, an understanding that actually it's good to have different levels of government, but it's even better if they work together, and we can progress towards some bigger things in this country. Maybe we can get through this together. We are at time, and I want to thank you very much for your contributions today. It was a really rich discussion. I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes that I can't read because my handwriting's terrible, but I'll get AI to fix that for me. That's the next conversation.
Good idea.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody, to everybody for listening in, and thank you for your questions. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you very much.